A young couple, Alice and Mark, set out on a road trip to explore a lesser-known national park deep in the heart of the Midwest. They had heard about the park from an old hiker in a forum who claimed it was untouched by modern tourism, brimming with raw, untamed beauty. Enthralled by the idea, they packed their gear and drove into the wilderness. But what started as an adventure became a nightmare they would never forget. After hours of driving on winding, empty roads, their GPS stopped working. The device kept insisting they were off the map, even though the park was supposed to be just a few miles away. With no cell service, they resorted to an old printed map they'd brought along as a backup. The map led them onto a narrow, unpaved road surrounded by dense forest. Shadows stretched long as twilight fell, and an uneasy silence enveloped them. They eventually arrived at what appeared to be an abandoned ranger station. The building looked weathered, its windows dark and cracked. They knocked on the door, hoping to get directions or at least confirm they were on the right track, but no one answered. Just as they were about to leave, Mark spotted a handwritten note taped to the door. "Leave before dark. Stay on the main road. Don't stop for anyone." The cryptic message unnerved them, but they brushed it off as some sort of bizarre local prank. After all, the station was deserted. Ignoring the warning, they decided to camp nearby for the night, thinking they could sort things out in the morning. As darkness fell, the woods came alive with unsettling sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling in patterns too deliberate to be wind-driven. A faint, metallic smell wafted through the air. Alice swore she saw movement in the trees, but Mark dismissed it as paranoia. To calm her nerves, they built a fire and tried to make light conversation. Around midnight, the noises intensified. Distant, guttural screams echoed through the forest, sending chills down their spines. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling their campsite. Mark grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive, deafening silence. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the woods, a man, disheveled and trembling, his clothes torn and dirty. He stumbled toward them, his eyes wide with terror. "You have to leave. They'll come for you," he gasped, his voice hoarse. Before they could respond, he froze, his face contorted in sheer panic. He turned his head slowly toward the woods, then bolted back into the trees without another word. Moments later, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness. It was unlike any animal they'd ever heard, a sound that seemed to reverberate in their chests, primal and menacing. Mark and Alice didn't wait to find out what it was. They grabbed their essentials and jumped into their car, speeding back down the dirt road. But the forest seemed to conspire against them. Trees loomed closer to the road, their twisted branches scraping against the car like claws. The road itself seemed to stretch endlessly as though they were driving in circles, and then they saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by their headlights. It wasn't the man who had warned them earlier. This figure was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its face obscured by shadow. Mark slammed on the brakes, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, staring, or at least they thought it was staring. Terrified, Mark decided to swerve around it, but as they passed, the figure's head snapped toward them with an audible crack. Alice screamed as she saw its face, a grotesque amalgamation of human and animal features, its eyes glowing faintly red. The car suddenly stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them stranded in the middle of the desolate road. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they frantically tried to restart the car. Outside, the growling returned, closer this time. Then came the tapping, a slow, deliberate sound on the driver's side window. Mark turned, his hands trembling, to see a pale, claw-like hand pressed against the glass. The figure's face loomed just beyond, its mouth curling into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. The car roared to life just as the figure began to claw at the window. Mark floored the gas, and they sped off into the night. They didn't stop until they reached the main highway, where the forest finally gave way to open fields. Only then did they feel safe enough to breathe. In the days that followed, they tried to find information about the park, the ranger station, and the surrounding area, but there was nothing. No records, no mentions on maps, not even a whisper of its existence online. It was as if the place had been wiped from history. To this day, they don't know what they encountered in those woods. But one thing is certain, they'll never venture off the beaten path again.
Story number 2.
It was a brisk autumn evening when Claire and her husband James set out on a weekend trip to a secluded cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The cabin was a last-minute find on a rental website, boasting serene views, a cozy fireplace, and complete isolation, exactly what they needed to escape the chaos of city life. Claire was thrilled at the thought of disconnecting, but James, ever the skeptic, couldn't shake an uneasy feeling about the trip. The drive took longer than expected. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the GPS led them down a winding dirt road, flanked by dense, towering trees. The deeper they went, the less they felt like they were heading toward a relaxing getaway, and more like they were being swallowed by the wilderness. Finally, the cabin came into view, a small, weathered structure with a sagging roof and windows covered by heavy, dusty curtains. It looked far less inviting than the pictures had promised. The first oddity was the key. The rental agency claimed they'd find it under the mat, but there was no mat. Instead, they found the key hanging from a rusty nail driven into the doorframe. As they unlocked the door and stepped inside, a musty, stale air greeted them. The furniture was sparse and old, and the cabin felt unnaturally cold despite the season. James flicked on the lights, and they buzzed dimly, casting shadows that seemed to flicker unnaturally. As they unpacked, Claire noticed strange carvings etched into the wooden walls. They were crude symbols, circles with jagged lines and shapes that looked almost like eyes. Local art, maybe? Claire joked, trying to lighten the mood, but James frowned, running his fingers over the grooves. That night, the uneasiness only grew. The cabin creaked constantly, its wooden bones groaning in the windless night. Around midnight, Claire heard what she thought were footsteps outside. She nudged James awake, but when he peered out the window, the yard was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. "Probably just animals," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. They tried to go back to sleep, but then came the whispers. At first, they were so faint Claire thought she was imagining them, a soft murmuring like voices carried by the wind. But soon, the whispers grew louder, distinct, and unsettlingly close. Claire clutched James's arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. James nodded, his face pale. He grabbed the flashlight and cautiously opened the front door, scanning the area. The yard was empty, but as the beam of light swung toward the tree line, they both froze. Just beyond the edge of the forest, a figure stood. It was tall and unnaturally thin, with long, gangly arms that hung awkwardly at its sides. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and though they couldn't see its face, they could feel its gaze. James slammed the door shut, bolting it with trembling hands. "We're leaving in the morning," he whispered. But deep down, they both knew they might not make it to sunrise. The whispers intensified, now coming from inside the cabin. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered erratically. Then, the scratching started, a sharp, deliberate sound, as if claws were raking against the walls. It moved from room to room, circling them, closing in. Suddenly, the cabin plunged into darkness as the power went out. Claire clung to James, her breath ragged. "We have to leave now," she begged. Just as they fumbled for their keys, the front door burst open, though there was no wind to explain it. A chilling presence filled the room. The figure from the woods now stood in the doorway, its face still obscured in shadow. But as it stepped forward, the shadows seemed to peel away, revealing a visage that defied comprehension, a hollow void where a face should have been, as if reality itself had warped to hide its features. James grabbed a fire poker, swinging it wildly, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it raised a long, bony hand and pointed directly at Claire. Her body stiffened, and a deep guttural voice echoed in her mind, not spoken aloud but invading her thoughts. "You shouldn't have come." Suddenly, the figure vanished, and the room fell deathly silent. Claire collapsed into James's arms, trembling uncontrollably. Without wasting another second, they bolted out of the cabin and into their car. The dirt road seemed endless as they sped away, the forest pressing in from all sides. When they finally reached civilization, they tried to report the incident, but the rental agency insisted they had no listing for that cabin. Curious, they drove back to the area weeks later, only to find no trace of the cabin at all. The dirt road was overgrown, leading nowhere, and locals swore no one had lived in that part of the woods for decades. To this day, Claire and James refuse to speak of what they saw that night. But Claire still wakes up sometimes, drenched in sweat, convinced she hears whispers just outside her window.
Story number 3.
In the fall of 1986, Lisa, a college student on a break, decided to take a solo road trip across the desert plains of New Mexico. She loved the solitude and had an appetite for exploring remote areas where few dared to tread. Her journey was going smoothly until she came across a weathered, hand-painted sign pointing to a shortcut toward her next destination. She debated taking it, but ultimately gave in to curiosity and veered onto the narrow, cracked road. As she drove, the scenery grew increasingly barren. No signs of life, no other vehicles, just an endless expanse of rocky plains and scrub. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery hues, and Lisa realized she hadn't passed a single town or gas station for miles. She glanced at her fuel gauge and frowned. She had enough to get to the main highway, but just barely. The shortcut didn't feel so short anymore. She turned on the radio to ease her nerves, but all she got was static. Annoyed, she turned it off and pressed on. As dusk fell, she spotted something strange in the distance, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, she thought it was a hitchhiker, but as she got closer, she saw that the figure wasn't moving. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a faded suit and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. He stood utterly still, staring straight ahead, not even glancing at her car as she passed. Lisa shuddered and gripped the wheel tighter. Something about him felt off. His posture, his stillness, it was unnatural. She shook her head, telling herself it was just a local or maybe even a scarecrow someone had dressed up for a joke. But when she glanced in her rearview mirror, the man was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign of movement anywhere on the empty road. Her unease grew as night fell. The road seemed endless, and her fuel gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. Just as she started to consider turning back, her headlights caught something up ahead. Another figure. It looked like the same man, standing in the exact same pose. Lisa's heart pounded. "No way," she muttered, gripping the wheel. She sped up, determined to pass him quickly. This time, as her car drew near, the man turned his head toward her. She caught a glimpse of his face, and her blood ran cold. His features were impossibly stretched, his mouth twisted into a grotesque, toothy grin that seemed too wide for his face. His eyes were black voids that reflected no light. As she drove past, his head swiveled unnaturally to follow her, the grin growing wider. Lisa slammed the accelerator, her car roaring down the empty road. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wheel, glancing in the mirror repeatedly. The man wasn't behind her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her car sputtered as the fuel gauge hit empty. She cursed under her breath as the engine died, coasting to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Lisa grabbed her flashlight and stepped out of the car, her shoes crunching against the cracked asphalt. As she tried to calm herself, a faint sound reached her ears. It was distant at first, but it grew louder. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. She shone the flashlight around, but the beam revealed nothing but empty road and desert scrub. Still, the sound persisted, growing louder and closer. Panicking, Lisa climbed back into her car, locking the doors and rolling up the windows. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. The footsteps stopped, and a heavy silence fell. For a moment, she thought it was over. Then came the knock. A single, sharp tap on the driver's side window. Lisa screamed, dropping the flashlight. She didn't dare look, but she could feel something just outside, its presence pressing against the thin barrier of glass. Slowly, she turned her head. The man was there, crouched unnaturally low, his void-like eyes peering in at her. His twisted grin seemed to stretch even wider, splitting his face like a gash. He raised a long, skeletal finger and tapped the glass again, the sound echoing in the stillness. Lisa scrambled to the passenger side, trying to get away, but as she did, the man disappeared. There was no sign of him outside the window. Her breathing was ragged as she scanned her surroundings, heart hammering in her chest. The car suddenly jolted, as though something heavy had landed on it. She froze, too terrified to move. Slowly, she tilted her head up, peering through the windshield. The man was on the roof, his face pressed against the glass, upside down. His grin filled her vision as he whispered, his voice seeping into her mind like oil. Nowhere to go. Lisa doesn't remember much of what happened next. She woke up the next morning in her car, parked at a gas station miles away from the shortcut road. The attendant said they found her slumped over the wheel, mumbling incoherently. Her car had no gas, yet somehow she'd made it there. She tried to tell her story, but no one believed her. The shortcut didn't appear on any maps, and no one had heard of a man matching her description. To this day, Lisa avoids long drives, especially at night, and she never, ever takes shortcuts.
Story number 4.
It was the middle of summer when Nathan, an amateur photographer, decided to explore an abandoned mining town deep in the Nevada desert. He had read about the town, Elkhorn Ridge, in an obscure online forum. It had been deserted for decades after a series of mysterious deaths in the 1940s. Nathan was drawn to the eerie beauty of decayed structures and forgotten places, so he packed his camera gear, filled his car with supplies, and headed out. The drive was grueling. Hours of barren landscape stretched endlessly before him, and the sun beat down mercilessly. As he approached the coordinates, the dirt road became rougher, almost as if nature was trying to reclaim it. By the time he reached the town, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the crumbling buildings. Elkhorn Ridge was a ghostly sight. Weathered wooden shacks leaned precariously, their roofs caved in from years of neglect. Rusted mining equipment littered the ground, and an old water tower stood like a sentinel, its frame creaking in the wind. The air was heavy and still, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Nathan grabbed his camera and started exploring. The town was eerily silent, save for the occasional scuttling of lizards or the distant cry of a crow. He wandered through the remnants of a saloon, its bar still intact but covered in decades of dust. A schoolhouse stood nearby, its chalkboard faintly marked with the ghost of old lessons. Each click of his camera seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the emptiness. As dusk deepened, Nathan noticed something odd. The air felt colder, unnaturally so, given the desert's usual heat. A faint metallic smell lingered, growing stronger as he ventured toward the old church at the edge of town. The building was in better shape than most, its steeple still intact, but the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the church was dimly lit by the last rays of the setting sun. Wooden pews lined the room, and a broken cross hung crookedly on the far wall. Nathan raised his camera to take a shot, but as he focused the lens, he froze. There, in the corner of the frame, was a figure. He lowered the camera and scanned the room. Nothing. The corner was empty, just a shadow cast by the steeple. Nervously, he raised the camera again. This time, the figure was closer. A tall, dark silhouette standing at the end of the aisle, featureless but unmistakably human. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, and the air seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy. A voice, low and guttural, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't be here." Nathan spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but the church was empty. Trembling, he backed toward the door, fumbling with the handle. It wouldn't budge. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the shadows in the room began to move. They stretched and writhed, pooling together in the center of the aisle. The dark figure emerged, now unmistakably solid, its head tilted unnaturally as it took a step forward. Nathan screamed, throwing himself against the door until it finally gave way. He stumbled outside, tripping over his own feet as he ran back toward his car. The desert was darker than it should have been, the stars obscured by a strange shifting mist. He reached his car and threw himself inside, locking the doors. As he started the engine, he glanced back toward the church. The figure stood in the doorway, its head still tilted, watching him. Nathan didn't look back as he sped down the dirt road. The drive seemed to stretch on forever, the mist clinging to his car and making it hard to see. He only stopped when he reached the nearest gas station hours later, his nerves frayed and his hands shaking. Days later, when he developed the photos he had taken, his heart sank. Every single shot of the town was filled with shadows, shapes that hadn't been there when he took the pictures. In the final shot, taken in the church, the dark figure was staring directly at the camera, its featureless face somehow radiating malice. Nathan never returned to Elkhorn Ridge, but sometimes, late at night, he hears the creak of old wooden doors and smells that faint metallic scent, as though the town wasn't quite done with him.
Story number 5.
It was the fall of 1993 when her three closest friends, Mike and Chris, decided to go camping in the remote wilderness of northern Maine. They wanted to disconnect, to escape the pressures of work and college, and to spend a long weekend off the grid. Chris had heard about a secluded spot by a lake deep in the forest, accessible only by a series of winding trails. It sounded perfect. The hike in was long and grueling, but when they arrived at the lake, the view was breathtaking. The water was mirror still, surrounded by towering pines, and the air was crisp and silent. They pitched their tents, started a campfire, and spent the evening laughing, drinking, and telling stories under the stars. As night fell, a dense fog rolled in across the lake, muffling the world around them. The firelight seemed to shrink, its glow unable to penetrate the thick mist. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, grew unnervingly quiet. Danielle was the first to notice it. She froze mid-sentence, her gaze fixed on the edge of the fog. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The others turned to look. At first, there was nothing, just the shifting mist. But then a shape emerged. It was faint, almost imperceptible but unmistakably human. The figure stood motionless, partially obscured by the fog, watching them from across the lake. "Probably just another camper," Mike said, though his voice lacked confidence. Rachel frowned. "Out here, we haven't seen anyone for miles." Chris called out, "Hello? You lost?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, a black silhouette against the white haze. Unnerved, the group retreated to their tents, the mood soured. But sleep didn't come easily. The air felt oppressive, heavy, and every snap of a twig outside made their hearts race. Around midnight, Danielle heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, she thought it was rain, but when she unzipped her tent and peeked outside, the sky was clear. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on a hard surface. It seemed to be coming from the trees. "Mike?" she whispered. "Chris? Is that you?" No answer. She crept over to Mike's tent and shook him awake. "Do you hear that?" Mike groaned, but sat up, listening. The tapping had stopped. "It's nothing," he said, though his eyes darted nervously toward the woods. "Go back to bed." Reluctantly, Danielle returned to her tent. Minutes later, the tapping started again, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural humming. It was close. Too close. Suddenly, Rachel screamed. Everyone scrambled out of their tents, flashlights cutting through the fog. Rachel stood by the water's edge, shaking and pointing toward the lake. "It was right there," she cried. "It was standing right there." The group shone their flashlights across the water, but the figure was gone. The lake was eerily calm, the mist swirling in unnatural patterns. "We're leaving," Chris said, his voice trembling. "First light." No one argued. The night dragged on, every minute stretching into an eternity. The tapping grew louder, echoing all around them, and the humming became a whisper. Words they couldn't quite make out, but that filled them with an inexplicable dread. Just before dawn, the whispers stopped. The group emerged from their tents, exhausted and on edge. They packed quickly, eager to leave, but as they turned to head back down the trail, they froze. The forest path was gone. The trail they had come up the day before had vanished, replaced by dense, impassable thickets. They tried to find another way, but every path led them back to the campsite. It was as though the forest itself was conspiring to keep them there. Panic set in as the sun rose higher, its light unable to penetrate the fog. They shouted for help, their voices swallowed by the mist. By afternoon, they were exhausted and disoriented. Chris suggested they follow the lake's edge, hoping it would lead them out, but as they started walking, the fog grew denser and the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent. The figure returned, stepping out of the mist ahead of them. It was closer now, its features barely visible, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. "What do you want?" Mike shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one skeletal hand and pointed at the group. The whispers surged, louder and clearer now, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language none of them understood. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse, and the air grew thick with the metallic stench of blood. Danielle couldn't take it anymore. She turned and ran blindly into the forest, her friends' voices fading behind her. Branches tore at her skin, and the whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. She tripped and fell, landing hard on the forest floor. When she looked up, she was back at the campsite. The fog had lifted, and the lake was still again. Her friends were gone. To this day, Danielle doesn't know what happened in that forest. Search parties found no trace of her friends or their gear, and the campsite was completely undisturbed, as though no one had been there at all. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she hears the tapping on her bedroom window, steady and deliberate, reminding her that whatever was in those woods isn't done with her yet.
Story number 6.
It was a quiet spring evening when Erin, a nurse working long night shifts, decided to take the scenic backroads home. The highway was faster, but she found the empty, winding rural roads calming after a stressful shift. She turned onto Miller's Hollow, a narrow, tree-lined path that cut through an area infamous for its desolation. Erin wasn't superstitious, though. To her, it was just a road. As the sun set, the woods surrounding Miller's Hollow grew dark and imposing. Shadows stretched across the pavement, and the only sound was the hum of her car engine. She turned up the radio to fill the eerie silence, but every station was static. Annoyed, she turned it off and focused on the road. A few miles in, Erin spotted something strange. A car pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. Slowing down, she saw a man standing beside it, waving her down. He looked disheveled, his face pale in the dim light. Reluctantly, she rolled down her window a crack. "Please," the man said, his voice trembling. "I need help. My wife, she's hurt. She's in the woods." Erin's instincts screamed at her to drive away, but her medical training took over. "What happened?" she asked, glancing around. The woods were impenetrably dark, and she couldn't see anyone else. She fell," the man stammered. "I tried to carry her, but I couldn't. Please, she needs help." Against her better judgment, Erin pulled over and grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment. The man led her into the woods, his movements hurried and desperate. "Where is she?" Erin asked as they plunged deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the air grew colder. "Just a little farther," the man replied. His voice was strained, almost too high-pitched, like he was trying to keep something out of it. After several minutes, Erin stopped. Something wasn't right. The woods were silent. Too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of insects. "Wait," she said. "Where exactly is she?" The man stopped ahead of her and turned slowly. His expression had changed. The desperation was gone, replaced by something unreadable but deeply unsettling. "She's right here," he said, stepping aside. Erin shone her flashlight where he pointed. There was nothing but an empty patch of forest floor. "Where?" she began, but her words caught in her throat as a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl. Erin's light flickered, and in that moment she saw them, shapes emerging from the darkness. At first, they looked like people, but their movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glinted in the light, reflecting like those of animals. "What is this?" Erin whispered, stepping back. Her heart pounded as the man smiled, too wide, his teeth sharp and unnatural. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice distorting, becoming guttural and alien. His form began to shift, his limbs elongating, his skin darkening into something that wasn't human. Erin turned and ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly. The woods seemed endless, the trees twisting and closing around her. She could hear them behind her, their guttural growls growing louder, their footsteps impossibly fast. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath her feet, and she tumbled down a slope, landing hard in a shallow creek. She scrambled to her feet, her breath ragged. The growling had stopped, but she didn't dare look back. Ahead, she saw a faint glow, her car's headlights. Fueled by adrenaline, she sprinted toward it, every step feeling like a lifetime. When she finally reached the car, she threw herself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. Her tires screeched as she sped down the road, not daring to slow down or look in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until she reached her driveway, hours later, that she finally stopped, trembling and soaked in sweat. The next day, Erin told herself it was just a trick of exhaustion, her mind playing games after too many long shifts. But when she went to check her car, she found long, deep scratches gouged into the sides, marks that looked like they'd been made by claws. She never took Miller's Hollow again. But sometimes, late at night, she swears she can hear growling in the distance, growing louder as the hours creep toward dawn.
Story number 7.
In the winter of 1978, a young couple, Jamie and Leah, decided to rent a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains for a romantic getaway. The cabin was advertised as off the grid, a cozy retreat surrounded by untouched wilderness. It sounded like the perfect escape from their hectic city lives. The road to the cabin was steep and winding, barely visible under the layer of freshly fallen snow. By the time they arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. The cabin itself was rustic but charming, with a stone fireplace and a single lantern for light. There was no electricity, no phone, and no neighbors for miles. That first night, they settled in, lighting the lantern and building a fire. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin's wooden walls, but inside they felt safe. Jamie laughed as they drank wine and played cards by the fire, and Leah teased him for losing every hand. Around midnight, Leah decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air. She pulled on her coat and boots, leaving Jamie by the fire. As soon as she stepped onto the porch, the cold hit her like a wall. The forest was eerily still, the snow-covered trees casting distorted shadows under the pale moonlight. Then she noticed something strange. Footprints. They were large, human-like, and led from the edge of the woods directly to the cabin. But there were no tracks leading away. "Jamie!" Leah called, her voice trembling. He came to the door, frowning at her pale face. "What is it?" She pointed to the footprints. "Someone's been here." Jamie grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to inspect. The prints were fresh, their edges crisp against the snow. They stopped abruptly at the porch steps. "Maybe it's an old hunter's path or something," Jamie said, though he didn't sound convinced. Leah shook her head. "It snowed all day. These couldn't be old." Jamie looked around, his flashlight scanning the forest. The beam caught something in the distance, a dark shape between the trees. It moved. "Get inside," Jamie said sharply, ushering Leah back into the cabin. He locked the door and checked the windows, but they were sealed shut. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller, its cozy charm replaced by a suffocating sense of isolation. They tried to brush it off, but the tension lingered. Jamie stayed up late, listening for any sound outside while Leah pretended to sleep. Around 3 a.m., just as he was dozing off, there came a soft, deliberate knock at the door. Jamie froze. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who is it?" he called, his voice cracking. No answer. Leah sat up, her face pale. "Don't open it." Jamie grabbed the fire poker and approached the door. The knocking stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. "Go away," Jamie shouted. The sound stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then the voice came. It was low and gravelly, speaking in a language they didn't understand. It sounded like words twisted and distorted, as if the speaker's mouth wasn't made for human speech. The lantern flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. Leah grabbed Jamie's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Jamie, don't say anything." The voice continued, rising and falling in a sinister rhythm. Then, with a final, guttural growl, it stopped. The couple stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching each other by the dying fire. When dawn broke, they cautiously opened the door. The porch was empty, but the snow was marked with deep, claw-like gouges, as though something had circled the cabin for hours. Jamie and Leah didn't stay to investigate. They packed their things and left, speeding down the mountain road as fast as the icy conditions would allow. When they reached the nearest town, they told a local about their experience. The man's face went pale. "You were in Pine Hollow?" They nodded. The man shook his head. "No one goes up there anymore, not after what happened to the last family that stayed in that cabin." "What do you mean?" Jamie asked. The man leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That place was abandoned years ago. Something in those woods doesn't like visitors. It doesn't let them leave." Jamie and Leah tried to laugh it off, telling themselves it was just a local legend. But when they reached home, they found long, deep scratches on their car, as though something had tried to stop them from escaping. They never went camping again.